Hey Bridge people, you'll notice today it looks maybe a little bit different in the cinematography, videography element. Ryan is pregnant, obviously, and so she's getting a day off today, which means I was in charge of setting this all up myself. And so even if it's acceptable, I will take it because that's the best I could pull off. And she's normally the one who makes all this happen. But today we're going to continue our series on Daniel, and before we get started, I just want to say this. Our schedule, of course, for the year has been, completely thrown off. I don't think any of us thought that this is what the past couple of months were going to look like and what the summer is going to look like. And so we're trying to still piece that together. But one thing I do know is that we're actually going to be taking next Tuesday off. We're not going to have a video next Tuesday. You're of course free to meet with your life group and hang out and talk if you want, but we're not going to be doing anything formal and official. It'll be a chance for your leaders to get a rest from you. And as much as you don't think they need that, sometimes they need a break, okay? It's okay. But we're going to be off next Tuesday. And then we'll have a little more information after that about what the summer is going to look like and what things are going to look like going forward. But until then, we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And so we're going to continue in our series on Daniel. And today we're going to be looking in Daniel chapter 5. And I noticed as I kind of looked back at some of the other videos, some of the other lessons, that I may be getting a little more long-winded in this series, a little more chatty. Ryan accused me of just liking the sound of my own voice, which I promise you is not the case. I cannot stand the way I sound at all. But I want to do my best to help us kind of keep it tight and keep us focused. And so we're going to then, because as I say that, we're going to read the largest of the passages that we've read yet. So I'm going to do my best in the midst of all that to kind of keep it tight. But as you'll probably remember if you've been participating during this series, we're kind of looking through the book of Daniel as this model of what it looks like to have faith in the midst of crisis. To have faith in the midst of a crisis, whatever that crisis might look like. And we talked about the way that Daniel was written as a guide for people who found themselves in the midst of a crisis. And so we're trying to kind of unpack Daniel in our context. And I think today's story actually is going to be very fitting because in a lot of ways it takes place in a moment that doesn't feel like a crisis. And my guess is that for a lot of us, right now doesn't necessarily have the same weight that it had a month ago or 2 months ago. We're starting to see more people, starting to see the world open up more, starting to feel things going back towards normal a little bit. And I think that the story today can help us see a little bit of what it looks like in that moment, what faith can still look like, but it also informs us what it looks like in general in the midst of chaos around us. And so what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 5 is an incredibly famous story that comes out of the book of Daniel, but one that we don't often see from a biblical context. It kind of gets more of like a literature rap. People write about it and talk about it because it's a cool story more than anything else. And so what we see, we're going to skip down into verse 18 in a second, so I'm going to give us some backstory. What we know is that Nebuchadnezzar dies. King Nebuchadnezzar dies. He doesn't just die, he goes crazy. And we have historical record to think that Nebuchadnezzar, or one of his heirs, who would have likely also gone by Nebuchadnezzar, or at least the Jews would have called him Nebuchadnezzar, did go mad. He went nuts, and he ended up living out in some fields and eating grass like a cow, and his life kind of fell apart around him. And so when he died, his son took over the throne, and his son's name is Belshazzar, King Belshazzar, and Belshazzar inherits the throne from his father. And that's going to be very, very short-lived. And I think most of us are aware of the sort of political things at work in this day and age, but the idea of inheriting a throne mattered a lot, and there's a lot put on inheritance. And so people who had a vested interest in Belshazzar not holding the throne made a deal with Persia to come and take control. And so we're going to see how that plays out. But as Belshazzar has inherited the throne, he throws a great banquet, this huge party for all the nobility, all the important people of Babylon. And in this huge party, his plan is to celebrate kind of his ascendance to power. Right? You can imagine for them, the king going crazy was a crisis. And now there's a stable leader who's in power. And this is something worth celebrating. It's this moment to rejoice for the Babylonians, to say, okay, we made it through the crazy king who ended up eating grass like a cow on all fours. Now we've got a real king. And so they throw this big party. And everyone's drinking, he gets some flack because he's got his wives and his concubines there with all the important people in a way that was probably inappropriate for the culture at the time. But this is a huge event that gets put on. And in the midst of all of that was happening, something miraculous happens, which is that a hand... It says in verse 5, and I'll just read this part so that we get the description. It says, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking." And we see that in Daniel chapter 5, verses 5 and 6, right? There's a huge party taking place. Everyone is drinking. Everyone is having a huge party, and then a human hand appears, almost like a mouse hand, right, and on your computer, and it writes on the wall. And when it doesn't tell us here what it wrote on the wall, but it's terrifying. And I think we could all imagine the terror that we would feel if we suddenly saw a hand appear on a wall and start writing on the wall in front of us. That would be a terrifying thing. So Belshazzar he's trying to get his enchanters to figure out what it says. And no one can figure it out. No one can figure out what it means, what the point of what's written on the wall is. And again, it makes sense. If a hand magically appears out of thin air and writes on the wall, it is important to figure out what the hand wrote. That just is, okay. You got to figure that one out. And so the king's mom, Belshazzar's mom, the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, actually says to him, "Well, your father had a man named Daniel who could interpret dreams. Why don't we go get him?" And so Belshazzar sends for Daniel, and he offers Daniel these great prizes, these great rewards, if he can just tell him what's written on the wall. And Daniel says, "I don't need the prizes, I don't need the rewards, but I will tell you what it says." And this is what we see in verse 18. It says, "Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was given away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have had the goblets from his temple brought to you. You and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent this hand that wrote the inscription." So right, Daniel says, basically, Belshazzar, you've brought this on yourself. Before he even gets to what the inscription says, he just lays into him. He just tells him, this is what is happening. This is why God has done what he's done. This is why you're seeing what you're seeing. And then he says this in verse 25. It says, "This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel parsin." Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Daniel gives Belshazzar this news. This is what the hand has written because of the things that you've done. Your kingdom will be divided. You've been found wanting. The Persians will come and take it over. And that very night, Belshazzar is killed, and Darius the Mede takes over. Darius, and we're inclined to think historically that Darius actually was one of the Persian generals at the time, who came in and began the conquest of Babylon that would end the Babylonian Empire. And you might think, okay, how is a story about a hand that appears on a wall relevant to our faith right now? How is it relevant to our lives right now? And I want us to see two things. The first is that faith in the midst of a crisis requires boldness from God. Faith in the midst of a crisis requires boldness from God. Daniel has the boldness to go before Belshazzar and say very, very difficult things. To say really challenging things. To go before the king. Imagine this. Someone ascends to power. They ascend to be king, right? They have all the power in the world, basically. And you have to go and say, this is happening because you're not humble. You followed the ways of your father. You haven't put your faith in God and you've trusted in idols. You have to go to him and you have to say that God has numbered the days of your reign. He's brought it to an end. To say you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. To even say your kingdom is about to be divided, taken from you. And for Daniel to go and do that, it requires the boldness from God. We often talk about prophecy, right, in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. We see people using this prophetic voice, this voice with which they speak on behalf of God. Or even God speaks through them. And Daniel has this moment, this prophetic moment. It's not that he's telling the future, it's that he's speaking on God's behalf. And he goes with God's boldness. There's a boldness of his words to actually say the things that he feels like God has called him to say. A boldness of his actions to actually go to before the king at all and say these things. And there's a boldness in his trust. That he trusts God, that God has sent him to be in this place, in this moment, to do this thing. And what my hope for each and every one of you is that you would have a boldness from God in this season to do the things that God has called you to. A boldness of words, a boldness of action, a boldness of trust. To actually put into practice the things that God has called you to. The things that he's designed you for. But the second thing we can see from this is that faith in the midst of a crisis requires humility from Jesus. Right? The complaint that God has against Belshazzar is mostly focused on his pride. Daniel is calling him into humility, or at least telling him, you should have been humble, you've now paid the price. And in Jesus, we have this perfect model of what humility looks like. Someone who deserved every praise and honor and yet poured himself out for others. Who sacrificed of himself for others. Who had all these freedoms and all these rights and all the glory and honor was that you could possibly imagine. But he was willing to pour those things out, to set them aside. And for us in the midst of a moment like this, I think we have to have a humility from Jesus. Modeled after the life that Jesus has for us. And in the end, what I think we'll find is that humility goes hand in hand with the boldness of trust. That at some level, the humility that we find in Jesus is actually a boldness in our trust of God. To see God for who He is and trust God for what He will do more than putting the confidence in ourselves. And I'm confident that if we have a boldness from God and we have our humility from Jesus, then when it comes time, what we won't hear from God, we won't have this moment right in verse 27 where it says, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. But instead what we'll hear from God is Him say, well done, my good and faithful servant. That when we live out our faith with the boldness, and we live out our faith with humility, and we live in the tension between the two, what we'll hear from God is Him saying to you, well done, my good and faithful servant. And so tonight in your life groups, you're going to have some time to talk about life, but even to think about what does it look like right now to have a boldness that comes from God, a boldness of words, a boldness of action, a boldness of trust. And what does it look like to have the humility of Jesus that says, I might have the right, I might have the freedom, I might deserve the honor and praise, but instead I'm going to empty myself of it. So that in the end I won't hear God say to me, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, but instead I will hear God say to me, well done, my good and faithful servant. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, God, we just pray that tonight you would give us an opportunity to hear from you. God, it's difficult to be bold if we don't know what it is you want us to be bold in. If you don't give us a vision and a wisdom, if we don't see the vision and the wisdom that you have for us. And so, God, we pray for your vision and your guidance tonight. We also pray for humility, God, that you would remind us what you have done for us, not of the things that we've accomplished on our own, but of the things that you've done through us, God. God, we just pray that you would bless this time that we have tonight. We pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.